In March 2023, a security researcher found a vulnerability in Microsoft search engine Bing that allowed him to change the search result of the page. Hilary Ben Sasson proved this by modifying the search result from the search Best Soundtracks from the soundtrack to Dune to the soundtrack to the movie Hackers from 1959. In a blog post, the researcher explained that he used a simple configuration option within Microsoft's cloud computing service Azure that enabled him to activate a function that made it possible for all users to be able to log in an administrator panel. Attacks like this are made possible by bypassing the access control of systems. A broken access control is a vulnerability in web applications which allows attackers exploiting it to be able to bypass authorizations, giving them the ability to gain access to resources or perform actions they normally should be able to. Broken access control is a very common web vulnerability, since at present about 94% of all applications were tested positive for this kind of web vulnerability. Due to this high distribution, this vulnerability is currently ranked first on the OWASP top 10 web security vulnerability list. In this video, you'll learn what access control is, the different ways of broken access control can be exploited, how an access control attack can look like, and how you can secure your web application from this kind of attack. What is access control? The access control of an application is used to constrain the possible actions a user can perform, as well as the resources they are authorized to access. In web applications, the access control usually works by using authentication measures as well as a session management. The authentication is used to identify a user. This is often ensured by user accounts where the access is protected by a password or similar authentication methods. The session management is used to identify if there are multiple HTTP requests that are made by the same user. This is usually done by using cookies. Access control is often divided into two categories: vertical and horizontal access control. The vertical access control mechanisms are used to prevent users without the necessary privileges to use sensitive functionality. For example, this prevents a normal user to be able to make modifications to other user accounts that normally only the admin of a page should be able to. Horizontal access control describes how normal users are restricted from accessing certain resources. In an online shop application, for example, horizontal access control could mean that a user is able to view their own purchase history, but never that from another user. If you want to learn more about the access control system, you can take a look at the link I will put in the description of this video. A vulnerability in the access control on a website is very common and often has severe negative impacts. This happens when the access control of an application is broken or not implemented properly. If that happens, users are able to act outside of their permission scope. A failure like this can result in unauthorized information disclosure, as well as the modification or destruction of up to all data of a website. Also, attackers bypassing the access control also get the ability to perform functions outside their limitations, which means they could access functions that are normally reserved for the website's administrators. Attacks that use a broken access control vulnerability are usually called privilege escalation. Privilege escalation attacks. Since there are two categories of access control, privilege escalation attacks can also be divided into two different categories: vertical and horizontal privilege escalation. A vertical privilege escalation describes the act of an attacker gaining access to data or functions they shouldn't have access to because their security level is below the one they should need for that action. This kind of attack happens when the attacker is able to elevate their privileges on a higher level, for example on that of an administrator. An example for that could be an application with a database where normal users can only read the stored data, but an administrator is able to add, modify, or delete data on the database. If an attacker escalated their privileges from a normal user to an administrator, they might be able to disrupt the integrity and availability of the application's data. A vertical privilege escalation can happen through a variety of ways. In many cases, it happens when the privilege management is not properly implemented or a user is assigned too many privileges. That could happen, for example, when a user with administration privileges leaves the company but is never removed from the administration group, so they still have access to all admin functionality if they log into their user account. It is also possible to exploit some flaws in the system to change the attacker's privilege level. In case of a horizontal privilege escalation, a user gains access to data or the ability to perform actions that are on the same security level they are actually on. This means that a normal user is only able to perform actions that are implemented for normal users to do so. Admin abilities, for this example, are not the target of horizontal privilege escalation. As an example, let's say we have two users that both have access to the same document, but the document contains data that should be only available to one of those users. So the other user shouldn't be supposed to see the user's data, but is able to as they escalated their privileges horizontally. An example attack of this is called pass the hash attack, in which the attacker is able to obtain the password hash of another user and by this can log into the other user's account and access their data. This type of attack can be very problematic as it's often very hard to detect and prevent. In contrast to a vertical privilege escalation, it's often not very obvious that the attacker is able to access data they are not allowed to access. Examples of broken access control. In the following, I will present you two demos where I show you how an attack on a broken access control system can look like. But there are many more ways to exploit a broken access control. If you want to learn more about the different ways, I recommend taking a look at the different labs at the Portswigger Web Security Academy provides via the link in the description. The first example for the exploit of a broken access control will be a vertical privilege escalation. For this demo, I'm using the Web Security Academy lab by Portswigger. Those labs provide deliberately insecure websites where you can try to perform an attack yourself in a legal environment. If you want to try it out yourself, I will put the link to this lab in the description. So for this example, I'm trying to access a page that contains administrative functionality, but the URL to that page is obviously not publicly known. Normally, the option to access administrative functions is not given to a normal user. However, it might be possible that a user is able to access those functions by browsing directly to the admin URL, which is often just /admin. In other cases, the admin page doesn't have an obvious URL like /admin, but the URL might be disclosed somewhere on the web application. So in the first step, we're going to examine the page. So in the top right corner here, we can see that there are links to the home page as well as the My Account page. And maybe I can find a hidden element there that takes me to the administrative page. So in the next step, I'm using the browser's developer tools to take a closer look to the page's source code. So now what I'm going to do is dig a bit around in the code and see if I can find something that might hint to an admin page redirection. All right, I'm looking up here because that's where I already thought I could maybe find something. And I'm seeing here that we actually have a script tag and bingo. So as you can see here, in the script tag that we just found up here in this part of the page, we have an if condition that checks if the current user is admin, and if the current user is actually admin, if that's true, there would be a third link that redirects us to this page. So I think that might be the admin page. So what we're going to do now is just copy this and put it up right to our URL up here. I got a double backslash here. So we're going to hit enter, and wow, as you can see here, that the link actually redirects us to the administrative page of the web application. And here we can see a list of different users that have an account on the page. And next to their usernames over here, Wiener and Carlos, there's a delete button located. So just let's try if we can delete the user Wiener. Wow, as you can see in the here, it actually worked. So that was a very simple example where we were able to elevate our privileges vertically, but we were actually able to delete a user without being logged in as an administrator. Alright, so for the second example, I want to show you how a horizontal privilege escalation attack can look like. So for this example, I'm also using the Podswigger Web Security Academy lab. And in this lab, we are trying to retrieve the API key from another user. So as you can see, if I go on my account, you can see here it says your username and the API key of the user Wiener. But we want to retrieve the key from the user Carlos. So for the first step, we try to find Carlos' profile page. For that, we're just going to search through the blogs and see if we find a blog post that is by Carlos. This one is by Wiener. This one is by Carlos. Great. So now we can click on his username. And we are here on his profile where we can see some blog posts that were made by him. And we can see up here in the URL that we now know Carlos' user ID, which is this one here right now. And we're just going to copy it to use it later on. So in the next step, we're going to return to the My Account page, where still our username is Wiener and the API key down here. But what we're going to do now is up here we have the ID for the user account Wiener, and we're just going to switch the ID from Wiener to the ID from Carlos we just retrieved, and just going to hit enter. And as you can see now, we are logged in as the user Carlos, and it actually gives us the API key from Carlos right here, which is a different one than the one from Wiener. By performing those simple privilege escalation attacks, we were able to perform actions that normally are only available to users with administrative privileges, and we were able to retrieve data that should only be accessible to other users, in this example for Carlos. Those were just some very simple examples, since the labs are deliberately implemented insecure. But since, according to OWASP, almost 94% of web applications suffer from some sort of broken access control, similar attacks to this might be possible anywhere. Preventing access control vulnerabilities. To prevent any privilege escalation attacks or any other problems occurring due to a broken access control management, it's important to implement proper access control security measurements. By applying a few principles to your system, you can ensure that users are only able to access the data and functionality available to their level of privileges. Centralized access control engine. When implementing your access control, avoid manually adding standalone access control checks for each function of your application. A centralized access control engine where all requests have to go through and have to be verified ensures avoiding any slip-ups and missing an access control functionality at some point. Deny access by default. The deny access by default policy makes sure that all resources, except for those you wish to be public, are designed to automatically deny access to a request. This avoids that any new additions to your application can become a security threat in case you didn't came around implementing a policy for that resource yet. Principle of least privilege. When applying the principle of least privilege throughout the entire application, you make sure that users are only able to access those resources and functionalities they need to properly use the application. Make sure to also think about this principle when deciding on which privileges your application is running on your system, since an application with root privileges can also pose a risk to your system in case of attacks like remote code execution. Perform access control checks on the server side. You should always perform the access control checks on the server side, as controls on the client side are easier to bypass. Your application should always consider all requests coming from the client side as dangerous and should always validate those on the server side before further processing them. Last, You should regularly perform audits and tests on your access control to ensure their functionality is working as intended. You can also do a semi-automated test if a low-privilege user can perform admin functionality by using the extension for Burp Suite called Authorization. I will put a link to this extension in the description. Now, to put everything together, by now you should have a good overview about access control vulnerabilities. Since the access control mechanisms of a web application play a huge role in preventing unauthorized information disclosure or users performing business functions outside their permission limit, failures in this system pose a great vulnerability to those applications. Since some sort of broken access control was found in about 94% of all tested websites, it's a very widespread web vulnerability, and website operators should definitely take steps to improve their access control by applying the principle of least privilege, using a centralized access control engine, and denying access by default. Make sure to follow those principles when implementing a web application. You will find all the links to resources and websites I mentioned in this video in the description, and if you're interested in learning more about web security, feel free to check out my other videos on that topic. Until then, I wish you a delightful day and see you soon in the next video. Goodbye.